belonging and kinship, and therefore can be regarded to some extent as a new form of determination, to the extent that they have a desire of mutualization of resources, but also collective action in order to have a particular impact in society. And so what we are focusing within this whole new episode is about describing the emergence of this network, but also trying to prescribe the specific recipes that could facilitate the evolution of this network into what we design as Network Nation. So I'm Primavera de Filippi. I'm a researcher at Harvard and at the CNRS. And then our co-host is Felix Beer.
Nice to meet you all. Super stoked to be here. Also researcher at Harvard and researcher at Blockchain Gov.
This episode, this season, is also part of like larger research project, which is called Blockchain Gov, which is a European funded project, which is specifically focused on distributed governance at the local, institutional, and global level. And this track on Network Nation is basically informed by, on the one hand, this observation that network technology are facilitating the emergence of those new network structure and social groups that have some characterization that could be compared to existing nation, but at the same time observing that this observation has also been tapped into by other actors, for instance, like all the network state community, which is kind of like trying to respond to this potential in a slightly different manner than what we're trying to focus on, in the sense that it's more of this corporate or libertarian approach to governance, whereas we're trying to focus more on how can we utilize like the tools that we have learned from the commons and from like mutualization and so forth, in order to actually provide an alternative version of how can those network community actually organize themselves on the global level.
So in this podcast will be very much about this question. So how can we create this new institutional wrapper, if you will, for these network communities, which we call network nations, and how can we build this in a way that it really empowers civil society around the globe in a bottom-up, participatory, and equitable way. So some of the questions that we will be diving into in the coming episodes are: how can we reimagine communities in general in a network age? What becomes possible when communities connect for shared purpose rather than geographies and borders in this world? How can social groups build trust and act collectively at a global scale? And how can decentralized technologies actually help them in doing that? And finally, how can these network nations that we're trying to describe here maybe help to bring about a more resilient and democratic future for all of humanity? And this podcast basically will be structured in two different formats, which are alternating. One of them we call the deep dive, is like a format that invites thought leaders and thinkers like Audrey Tang, Michelle Bounds, or Sarah Horowitz to join us and discuss specific concepts that we want to integrate into the theory of network nations, like commoning, like mutualism, like sovereignty. And then on the other side, we have the community spotlight format, which is an invitation to existing communities who we believe have certain features and characteristics that are very adjacent or similar to what we're trying to describe with our network nation theory. So here we will invite some people from CDAO, Burning Man, pop-up city leaders, and also the region network itself. The first episode we are bringing to you today is basically the introduction to our thinking about network nations. Our thinking is still nascent and emergent, so these are all ideas which are work in progress. We hope to also develop our thinking through this podcast and want to also invite all of you as listeners to join us and refine these ideas. In the end of the episode, we will give away some information on how you can actually join us in collaborating around these kind of ideas. But yeah, so the first episode wants to basically outline what a network nation is from our perspective, why we believe it matters, how it is also importantly different to the network state, which is often compared, or which is like a very well-known concept, of course, which has certain similar features, but is in many ways actually quite different to what we are trying to build. And lastly, we want to also outline what kind of movement we are currently trying to work on and develop, because with the help of some collaborators, we're currently building a community platform, which will also offer a lot of you guys the opportunity to get involved with our thinking. So to get us basically started with this episode, I would like to invite you basically, Primavera, to share a bit about the origin story of Network Nations. This is a concept which has been floating around in different forms over the last 3 years or 4 years. So there was some tinkering and thinking behind the scenes. But before we go into the actual theory and the concept and the definition of what a network nation is, I think it's interesting to understand like how this thinking evolved in the first place.
Yeah, basically the idea came in a very organic and decentralized manner. But basically, we had been unknowingly preparing the ground for those ideas because as a little group of researchers and beyond and practitioners, we have been already exploring intentional communities and like collective living and also like networking amongst those different intentional communities. We started already theorizing the governance within the groups and amongst the groups and like all the rhizomatic networks that come out of it. And then also from an academic level, we started this whole track of institutional theory, which was particularly looking at like how social dynamics exist outside of existing institutions and kind of like interweave amongst different social groups. We also, together with scholars, we had been working on the concept of cloud community and blockchain-based virtual nation and all these things, like trying to look about how those things actually scale up and how Web3 technology or decentralized technology more generally facilitate those new form of global and distributed coordinations. And then I guess what was actually the strong catalyst was the publication by Balaji of the book, The Network State, which was a highly expected, a high expectation from this book, and perhaps a little bit of broken expectation when we actually read the book, because somehow those are all ideas that we had been resonating with, but somehow the way in which it was articulated in the book was not very resonant with the way in which we had been envisioning those ideas. And so this kind of like launched this whole movement, I guess. At the time, we didn't call it Network Nation yet, but we were already working on like trying to find a name for it. And like the first name that was somehow instantiated was the name Coordination. And as Zuzalu started, we got invited by the organizer of Zuzalu to actually talk about this alternative to the network state, which is the coordination. And so we had a first gathering where we invited like 15 people, and then we somehow aggregated together with the people that were local already to Zuzalu in order to try and theorize. And the theory, of course, it was always inspired from what we could see already, what we could see emerging, because everything is very prototypical. And then following Zuzalu, we continued as a group to continue the research, to continue the conceptualization. We have done a lot of events together with HCT. We have done also a lot of academic conferences at the UI, at the University of Paris. And then recently, we also had this gathering at Emerge Lakefront, where we also try to bring about many practitioners with the idea that it's not enough to just conceptualize those ideas, but we also need to be practical, and we also need to somehow try to create a movement which is embedding thinkers and scholars that are kind of conceptualizing the theory, but also practitioners that can experiment and implement this theory, and also provide this kind of like constant feedback loop between the practitioner and the theorists and the scholars in order to advance together into moving into something that can be instantiated as an actual network nation.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I came. I think I joined this kind of initiative maybe 1 or 2 years after you guys started thinking about it. But it's interesting that although I didn't have touching points with you guys before, I knew a lot of other communities who had similar ideas around how to organize, collective action for networks, how to rethink basically governance beyond the nation state and so on. So it seems to be like an idea which is very latent in a lot of bubbles at the moment, and which kind of like converges around similar ideas. And I think like part of this entire initiative we're trying to draft here is to create kind of this Schelling point of weaving all these different kind of communities and their ideas around how to create networked governance for civil society together. But yeah, having said that, I think it's maybe the right moment to talk about the concept itself, network nations. So what is this idea actually, and how would you define it, Pia?
Yeah, so we came up with a preliminary definition, which is quite dense and can be unpacked. The definition is essentially, first and foremost, the characterization of what constitutes the nation part of a network nation, which is a network of translocal communities which are united by a collective identity, a shared culture, and an aspiration for a common future, right? And so the translocality is basically referring to the fact that it is about distributed communities which are geographically located at many different places, but somehow interconnected, right? And so as opposed to like globalization, where you just have like something that replicates everywhere, translocality really talks into the fact that you maintain the specificity of the local nodes, and yet all those local nodes are interconnected into a larger mesh, which somehow also empower them to because of those interactions. And so those translocal community are somehow recognizing themselves as having commonalities, and those commonalities are a commonality of culture, a commonality potentially of values or some kind of affinity because of those interaction with one another, or also because they just somehow manage to build a similar culture and therefore they want to interconnect. And it is this particular sense of common culture that leads to the emergence of this new collective identity that people recognize themselves as being part of. And therefore, once you recognize that you're part of the same culture and the same collective identity, there is also this sense of kinship, solidarity, and also a desire of fostering each other because we want to have a future in common, right? And this is what somehow define at the level of like the network nation, where when does an online community is not just an online community anymore. It's not just a group of people that are enjoying similar interests or are just enjoying to chat with each other, but there is really a cultural shift. And the most important part of the cultural shift is the collective identity that emerged out of that. And so when we're talking about the network nation, the most important thing is this concept of translocality. And when we talk about translocality, we're also talking about network of networks, right? Or networks of communities. So it's not just individual that are recognizing each other as being part of this distributed network, but it's like local communities which are translocal because they connect with other community around the globe. And this is what creates this mesh of networks that initiate, at least create the prototype for a network nation to emerge.
Right. And I think so. So these kind of nations kind of are emergent. They are partially existing already, right? Let's maybe make this a bit more concrete. So if you think, for instance, about the bioregional movement, you have a lot of place-based communities around the world, right? Translocal. So you have some maybe in Europe, others in America, yet others are in Asia, and they all share a similar culture, right? They're all trying to aspire for regenerative principles to bring about like ecological change in society. So they are hypothetically very much adjacent and aligned in terms of their values. Yet they don't have really a container, an institutional format, you could say, to really coordinate on a global scale. So I think the question we're trying to pose with Network Nation is how can we interweave these existing value-aligned communities into a networked governance framework that allows them to coordinate not only on the local scale, but also on the global scale together. And in this way, they can really leverage their collective impact, right? So when we talk about network nations, we kind of draw we kind of like focus on two different levels of purpose, which they're striving towards. So there is, in a way, like an internal dimension of these network nations, which is really focused on a lot of the stuff P just outlined, right? Like creating a sense of shared culture, creating kind of a community of kinship, and all these things which really strengthen trust within a network, right? This is like the internal dimension is really about like creating a network which is aligned in terms of their culture and which has very strong connections between the nodes. Then there's an external purpose on top of that, which is oriented towards the world. So these networks, which are very coherent and trust rich, they want to act on the world. So they need basically governance frameworks and instruments which allow them to coordinate in a way that they can actually achieve collectively impact, right? So that would be if you tie it back to the example of bioregionalism, this would be kind of like a global network of bioregions, which has coordination, governance toolings and infrastructures which allow them to really coordinate their efforts in a way that they can collectively achieve much more in terms of bringing about like a regenerative change than any of these single units could by themselves.
And one important element on those internal and external purposes is that, of course, both of them are needed, but also to distinguish between standard online communities. So if we take like bioregionalism versus, for instance, a distributed global community of environmental activists, it's very different, where you have something where the external purpose come first, which is there is a goal and a community emerge in order to serve that goal, but the community is kind of the means to the end, where you need a community of people to pursue a particular collective action, which is more of a traditional political actor, of like a community getting together to act,
Right.
as opposed to a network nation where the intrinsic purpose is actually the community itself, is like creating things that foster that community, and then the collective action is actually in order to foster the community. And so in this case, collective action, the goal to act outside of the community is the mean in order to actually foster and reinforce and actually help the community thrive as a community. And that's in this second case that we can talk of a network nation as opposed to just a standard activist community of the like. Even though, of course, there is no such thing as a network nation that just has one, that just has an internal purpose without collective action, or that just have collective action without an internal purpose. But in terms of prioritization, the goal, the external goal, is usually the means to the end of actually the desire of a community to foster itself, and therefore to engage into this mutualization of resources and solidarity systems in order to actually help and actually together proceed towards this shared future.
Right. I think another way to put this is also that what a network nation is in the end a network of a lot of different communities. And if we think about networks per se, we often think about scale of connections, right? So networks, if we think about social networks or activist movements, they're really trying to connect a lot of dots across the world. But often what they lack is a very strong sense of kinship, of trust, and of like the strength basically of these ties between the nodes in the network. It's really about scale. But then communities on the other end, the ones we know usually, they're very good in actually creating reciprocity, trust, and so on a small scale, though, right? Like if you think about intentional communities, for instance, they are great in integrating members into like a shared kind of culture, into a shared kind of set of principles, but they often have difficulties to scale this on a larger level. So what the network nation kind of proposes is to build a bridge between these two dimensions to connect the scale of a network with the trust richness of a community and create a network of communities. So what is really at the core of this entire exploration, I guess, or this entire concept is the question of how can we create relationships which are strong at scale, basically. And I think our hypothesis is that actually scaling trust-rich relationships and enables us collectively to have more impact in the world. Because it's not only often about the quantity of relationships which allow you basically to govern in good ways. There's a lot of research which shows that if you create trust-rich environments, that people are willing to take greater risks together, that people are more flexible and adaptive when it comes to solving challenges, and that they're also more resilient because people can obviously rely better on each other. and there is a stronger sense of solidarity. So I guess what network nations are really trying to do is creating like these relationships, these trustful relationships at a scale where they can actually make a impact on a global level.
One of the important components of all of this thinking and movement is that we are kind of like playing in this like fine line between like what we are observing happens and what we prescriptively would like to happen. Meaning that on the one hand, we're observing things emerging and we're trying to understand what's happening, which is like observing how those network community are coming into being and organizing themselves. But also, because everything is a proto network nation so far, we also want to kind of create a vision, a destination, which is the full network nation construction. And then we have this kind of prescriptive recipes of like, well, if you want to move from where you stand into an actual network nation, here is ways to do it, but also constantly observing how communities evolve, also following those guidelines, and then helping refine the concept together in this kind of participatory approach. And so we've been working together with a bunch of communities as a way of exemplification in order to illustrate this concept. We have like two communities that are quite close to this work and also are interested themselves into walking down the path into becoming more of a network nation. The first one is Burning Man. So Burning Man is a very interesting example, case study, because they did very good. They excelled at one part of the network nation, which is the sense of nationhood, which is actually creating translocal communities with a lot of different regional events, regional communities that all share the same culture, the same principle, the same affinity of a particular future that we are trying to construct, everyone with their own local specificity, while also, of course, understanding that together it makes more sense and together you have more impact and also a desire of mutualization and so forth. So the Burning Man community is actually a very archetypical example of what a translocal community of networks of communities look like, with this dimension of like there is increasingly a desire within the Burning Man organization and community of actually going further. It's like because this culture has become so strong, and what makes an exemplification that this culture is so strong is the fact that people actually name themselves as an identity to be a burner. Like people that actually feel that they really belong to this community, they actually start assigning themselves the collective identity of a burner. And over times, because now it's been many, many years that this community is building, there is more tangible desire of actually moving further towards this mutualization, towards this collective action, collective governance that goes beyond just individual events organizing themselves and just interconnecting, but really like increasing the degree of entanglement and increasing the degree of collective governance that can happen at the level of the network itself rather than just focusing on those individual nodes.
Right. Another example to further illustrate this is one which is very familiar, I guess, to most of the listeners of the Green Pill podcast. It's the region movement itself. I think it's like an excellent example, actually, to illustrate some of these dimensions, because regions have a very strong shared identity. They want to bring about, similar to the bioregional movement, ecological change in the world, and they want to do this through means and ends of the Web3 technological space, I would say. So on the one hand side, they have a very strong external purpose, to come back to the terminology we introduced before, because they have a mission to bring about ecological change via Web3 technologies in the world. But at the same time, they're also cultivating along this journey actually a set of cultural rituals, like a language, kind of modes of being together in these kind of communities, which create a very strong kind of sense of shared identity. And I think it's very visible. I think the Green Pill podcast is actually an excellent example in itself of this, because a community around these, ideas and aspirations to bring about change is creating this space where they're inviting, like their peers to speak. And like you can really sense, like when you listen to Green Pill podcast series, that there's like a shared vernacular kind of emerging from these common projects. So in this way, the region movement brings together these two dimensions of internal and external purpose in an interesting way. And interestingly, actually, I think Region DAO is calling itself now a coordination, which was the preceding formulation or conception of the network nation, because they realized themselves actually that this is what they want to build. They want to build like a strong network of all these different kind of regenerative Web3 communities around the world, some working maybe in Asia, as I said before, some others in Europe, others in America, in a structure where they can coordinate their actions. And I think what's interesting, all of a sudden, when you have all these resources bundled up in this kind of like networked institution of like the region DAO, you can start thinking about like how to actually allocate resources, time, efforts much more efficiently, and how you can coordinate across the world to actually push for more systemic change, because maybe some communities want to focus actually on financial aspects of regeneration. Other ones want to build coordination and DAO tooling, and so on and so forth. And by bringing in more and more communities with different expertises, different resources, different projects, you're really starting to build like a more cohesive and powerful entity, which then taken together, can actually hopefully move the needle on the question of the economic transition towards more planetary well-being.
And I think those two examples are very interesting because they are starting almost from opposite direction but ending up on the same space, where Burning Man is very advanced at the level of like the nationness, the nationhood, and like the sense of kinship and solidarity and the common culture and identity, but maybe is not so advanced on the tooling and on the actual mutualization or collectivization, commoning, etc. Whereas like the region started from the collective coordination and commoning and like collectively dealing with resources, and is slowly evolving into this like more identity and nationhood that also emerge out of it.
Right, yeah. So I think this is also a great potential for this movement in general, the cross-pollination between these initiatives. And I think this is something we see again and again, especially in the Web3 space, right? Where we have very sophisticated tooling. There's a lot of DAOs, there's a lot of, like technological innovations on how to coordinate in better ways, but often they really lack the substance of a shared strong identity and culture to really turn them into a political entity. So I think there is a lot the Web3 community, and I think actually the regions are already a prime example of like expanding that vision. But like a lot of these Web3 initiatives can really, I think, also draw and learn from other more culturally oriented or socially oriented movements, and vice versa.
Which brings us to the important question of like, why are we talking about nations as opposed to just communities?
Right.
Which is an interesting and contentious questions, because of course the concept of nation is quite loaded with a lot of connotation. Some of those connotations are extremely positive and some of them are more negative. And basically the problem is that nation is now very associated with the issue with nationalism, which is itself mostly linked with the concept of the state, right? And so in some way, like what we're trying to do, and this is of course an open debate, is to find this word and kind of like extract it from the connotation of the nation state, because oftentimes when we talk about nation, we actually mean nation states and therefore more of the state than the nation. Whereas the nation, if we manage to disentangle it from the state, has actually a very different connotation and meaning. And essentially, this also relates to, of course, the contrast, compare and contrast with the network state, which is what we're actually focusing on, is the emergence of a particular sense of community and population and a sense of belonging, which has this kind of like similar characteristic as the nation, which is the fact that because of this cultural sense of community, then all of students, even if you meet someone that also recognized as part of the same collective identity and never had any interaction with, neither directly nor indirectly, all of students, you do have this sense of kinship because you recognize the same culture, the same system into this other person, and all of students, you know that you're part of the same thing.